Kia ora and hello, friends. Welcome back to the Restoring Connections podcast. I am Matthew Dawson. Thanks so much for tuning in. As per normal, we are talking about healing and strengthening our most important relationships, the relationships that you want to last all the way till the end and just keep getting better and better and better. We're talking about personal responsibility. We're talking about proactive care. We're talking about powerful communication, and we're talking about healthy boundaries. And this particular episode, I'm going to attempt at keeping a bit shorter than what we normally do. And so we'll see how we go with that. You guys know I tend to have a lot to say, but I'm going to try to keep it to a minimum. I'm already not on a very good start, am I? Talking too long about the fact that I want to keep it short. Okay, so the title of this episode is "What Would It Take to Make This Right?" Where this came out of, the idea for this particular podcast came out of a leaders meeting that we were having with our Restoring Connections leaders group. And we liked every other week in our leaders meeting, we basically pick a particular line in our Restoring Connections Foundations course curriculum. So there's 16 sessions, and so we pick one of those items and we dive into it, and we essentially we sort of squirm our way through the difficult introspective questions that we've come up with. And it's we often laugh. We're kind of like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we ask people to ask these questions, because they're deep and they bring things to the surface that people like me, who are mostly focused on everything sort of happy and lovely in life, try to avoid. But it brings things to the surface that need to be dealt with, that need to be worked through, because that's a really important part of any healthy relationship, any healthy life, is you gotta give space for those things to come to the surface. So this particular recent leaders meeting that we were having, we were diving into a part of our curriculum it's within the healthy boundaries aspect of the curriculum. And the item is, or the session is, I set up boundaries and I break down walls. And so it's saying there, I use the cultivation of healthy boundaries for me. Remember, a boundary is something that you give yourself. A boundary isn't something that you oppose on someone else. That's like a punishment, A boundary is something that you decide for yourself. For example, I am no longer going to talk about this particular thing with this particular person, because every time I've done that in the last 20 years, that has made this relationship worse, right? So it's a boundary that you create for yourself. Or waking up at a certain time, going to bed at a certain time, all those kind of things. It's in the healthy boundaries section. So we're talking about often if we don't have healthy boundaries in our lives, we've got to replace that, because that creates such a sense of being out of control. You've got to replace that with something. And usually what takes place there is we end up building resentment, bitterness, and it's what we would call walls in our relationships with people. And that is no good, especially if it's someone who is actually an important part of your life, family members. Hey, maybe even it's someone you are married to, maybe even it's one of your children, and you sort of realize, man, I've got this like thick layer. It's like a callus, right? So I'm a guitarist, and I, the more I play, the more you end up with these calluses on your fingers. And it's kind of a helpful thing. It's your fingertips basically go numb. They no longer feel the pain while you're playing guitar. And if we're not careful, as we go through the pain of situations in our relationships, we end up with it's like a callus forms over your heart. And we just find the pain becomes so much that we just end up needing to shut down as a way of endurance, as a way of surviving. And so we're talking about, right, the difference between a healthy boundary and a wall. And a wall is basically like an unscalable thing. There's no way back. There's no way for this relationship ever to be restored, right? That's very different than, hey, I've got a healthy boundary in my life, but I'm hoping that maybe restoration is still at least a possibility. So when we ask that question that we're diving into, what would it take to make this right? I'm not actually thinking of that as a question that you're asking someone, right? Maybe you've got somebody in your life who you feel kind of ghosted by, or that have, they've distanced themselves from you, and you're wondering, how do I make this right? It's actually not what we're talking about. I'm talking about more you knowing within your own mind, you having clarity about what it would take for someone else to make something right with you, someone who has caused you pain, which might sound kind of obvious. Like, well, if this person's caused me pain, it's obvious what they would need to do to make it right. But if you really think about it, quite often it's not that obvious. And this is what we were realizing again, in our leaders meeting the other day. We were asking this question, like, think of somebody who has caused you really significant pain in your life. And maybe you would be quite happy actually to never see this person again. But for the sake of your own heart, not cultivating bitterness and resentment, ponder for a moment, what would it take for this person to restore your trust? Which remember, if you've listened to other podcast episodes, you've heard us talking about the difference between love and trust. They're very, very closely related cousins, but they are distinct, right? And so what would it take for, let's say someone's wounded me, hurt me. What would it take for me to have no resentment towards this person anymore? What would it take for me to not have bitterness towards this person? That probably doesn't really depend on them. I mean, they might be able to do things that help in that process, right? But ultimately, my resentment towards someone is just that. It's my resentment, right? It's the resentment I am carrying in my heart towards someone else. And so I need like a miracle of love on the inside of me to be able to deal with that, and for me to not basically hate this person anymore. But what we're talking about here, though, is what would it actually take for them to restore trust in this relationship? And oftentimes we just sit there and we think, I wouldn't have a clue. I have no idea what in the world it would take for this person. It feels completely impossible. And we've got to be really careful about that. I find that in my own life, if I let that be the case, if I let that basically this is just a complete wall. There is no way this person is ever getting back into my life. It's really, that is a breeding ground. That is perfect soil for the cultivation of bitterness and resentment. And ultimately, it's the confusion that really messes with us, right? We often talk about this, that in a situation where there's pain, what really kills a relationship isn't so much the pain of it, it's more the confusion around that. Because your mind has to basically come up with an explanation. It's a little bit like, if your arm gets blown off, imagine your body trying to figure out what the heck just happened. Imagine your lungs are trying to figure out what just happened, and your arm just got blown off. And where are your lungs going to look for an explanation? Your lungs are going to look to your brain for some kind of an explanation. What the heck just happened? We're in shock. What's going on here? When it comes to your heart, your emotional reality, you go through something incredibly painful, and it's we're not wired for it. We're not wired for it any more than we're wired for our arm getting blown off, by a landmine. It's like, this is not what we're created for. We're created for connection. We're created for harmony, for oneness. And we go through something and it rips that apart, and the heart needs some kind of an explanation. And that's where your mind, goes into overdrive, right? About, with trying to come up with an explanation of what's happened here. And you end up, probably, if you're anything like me, and like everybody I've ever talked to, you end up in some degree of a judgment cycle where you've got all this judgment coming towards yourself, right? And all this judgment coming towards the other person. So towards yourself, it's, what have I done wrong? What should I do now? Have I done enough? Am I the problem? Right? Sound familiar? And then all of those are like two, that's one side of the same coin. The other side of the coin that matches that is, what the heck is wrong with you? Why can't you change? Like, where does this come from? How do you sleep at night? Can't you see you're the problem, right? And then we go circle back around. So, what should I do? Have I done enough? And round we go. And the brain is sort of grasping for some kind of explanation. It's like you're lost at sea, especially if it's in a really close relationship. You can feel so lost at sea. Somebody please help me understand what in the world, where am I? Where am I in this situation? And more importantly, how do I get out of this? I was chatting with somebody who I've been doing some, I've been, helping a little bit in their journey. And I was asked, we're kind of working through the possibility of a potentially challenging conversation they need to have with somebody. And I'm saying, well, what is it that you want? What would be the driving desire here? What would be the outcome? And this person just said, it was in this wonderful moment of honesty and vulnerability, just said, I'm just so tired of feeling so angry. I just don't want to feel this anger anymore. And I'm like, yeah, dude, come on. Let's go there. That sounds really good. Let's get to the version of you that's no longer carrying this pent up, anger. Maybe the pain can still be there. Maybe the pain can still be there. Maybe it needs to be there. Maybe there can be some sadness, but we want to be able to move forward. And so, okay, so circling back around to this, what would it take for this person to make this right with me? What would it take for this person to actually re-earn my trust? I'm offering this to you. As you're listening to this, I'm offering to you something that I have found so incredibly powerful in unburdening myself from resentment building up. And I've got to actually stop and ponder this for a moment and use my imagination and explore, what would it actually take? And I mean, we're talking about, what if you've been sexually molested by somebody? What if you've been abused? What if someone has stole? I mean, I was with somebody, recently, who's going through a potential lawsuit with someone, and there's $100,000 basically that they've lost in this process. And the desire for justice, it's like, man, what would it even take for, at this point, for not just like justice to be satisfied, but could you actually imagine this person could you imagine trusting this person again? What would that take? And it can just feel impossible. But as you slow down and you ponder that, and you start to imagine the possibility, and again, they might never do this. I might even go so far as to say they probably won't. They might never, ever do this. The point of what you're cultivating here is that you're breaking down a wall here by your imagining. I was doing this with somebody, who has caused me a lot of pain, and I was imagining myself go through this process, and I realized, yeah, actually, there is a way back for this person. There is a way back for this person into my heart, and actually, it would be this. And straight away, I'm like, there's no way. There is no way that this person would ever do it. And I've got to actually let that go. I've got to let that judgment go. And I've got to embrace, you know what? They might. They might. And if they did, I would be waiting right here. So I've got healthy boundaries in my life. I'm not necessarily holding my breath for that moment, but I know I've done the work in my own heart of working through that there is a way back. There is a way. They're not going to run into a brick wall. The moment, if they got to a point where they had a change of heart and wanted to make something right with me, there would be a way back. And it's amazing, as we were doing this, I've done this so many times over the past probably, 10, 12 years, But, just recently, as we were going through this process again, I was reminded of what an incredibly freeing, unburdening process this is, to actually take the time to really cultivate and even write down, this is what it would take for this person to make this right with me, right? And so I'm not, my boundaries are where they are, but there's something shifting in my heart. What I'm in that process, somehow, somebody a lot smarter than me would have to unpack. I'm just saying it works. Someone a lot smarter than me would have to unpack why that works, right? All the theology behind it and all the psychology behind it. I just know it works. It's incredibly powerful. I know there's, the couple thoughts that come to my mind. One thing that's happening is my pain is being validated as real, right? I'm not saying that, by saying the pain is real, I'm not, that's not a judgment statement about somebody else. I'm not saying what they did was wrong. That's a totally different thing, right? I would argue that's really between them and God. But I'm acknowledging this, the pain that I've experienced, that is real and that is valid. And I'm coming to terms, I'm making peace with that there is a way back for this person. And it's like resentment all of a sudden is looking for a place to land, and it has nowhere to land. And it's freeing me. And it's the peace. I'm jumping off of that judgment cycle, because basically what I'm saying, I'm no longer asking the question, what should I do? Have I done enough? Am I the problem? What's wrong with you? Why won't you change? How do you sleep at night? I'm no longer asking any of those questions. I'm actually just going, yeah, I went through something incredibly painful, and you played a significant role in that incredibly painful thing that I experienced. And I love you. Trust isn't restored between us. And in the meantime, I've got some healthy boundaries. And there is a way back for you if you want it. You may not. I may not be important enough to you to want to make this right with me. And that hurts, but that's okay. But if you did, there would be a way back for you. Whew. And it's like your mind is like, oh, cool. Can we get back to being focused on awesome things? Because this confusing judgment cycle was not getting us anywhere anyways. Okay, so I'll leave that as an offering to you. I don't know how long that was. Hopefully it was a little bit shorter than our normal ones. Lots of love, friends. Kia kaha. Grace to you, strength to you, as you seek to heal and strengthen the most important relationships in your life. See ya.
We hope you found the conversation and stories on today's podcast helpful and insightful. If you want to go deeper, Restoring Connections offers online courses that cover key topics like personal responsibility, proactive care, powerful communication, and healthy boundaries. Go to www.restoringconnections.nz for more information. This podcast is funded by generous supporters from all over the world. Please consider supporting by going to the Restoring Connections website and hitting the Contribute button. By partnering with us, you're helping to provide mentoring, workshops and training to others who are also restoring their connections.